The debt collector arrived in Harlan's Crossing on a Tuesday, which was the worst possible day for anyone to arrive anywhere with bad intentions, and Virginia Hale knew it the moment she looked up from the post office counter and saw the shadow of him fall long and dark across the warped wooden floor. It was the spring of 1878, and the New Mexico Territory was not a place that suffered strangers lightly. The sun came down hard on the adobe and the dry creek beds, and the wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the Rio Puico like something with a grievance of its own. Harlan's Crossing had maybe 300 souls on a generous count, a general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph station, 2 saloons, a church that leaned slightly to the east as though God himself had grown tired of holding it upright, and a sheriff who spent most afternoons asleep in his chair with his hat pulled down over his face. It was the kind of town that existed because the land around it demanded human persistence, and not for any particularly good reason beyond that. Virginia Hale was 24 years old, and she had been running the post office and telegraph station since her father collapsed behind that very counter 2 years prior from a heart that had simply decided it was finished working. She had not left when he died. She had not left when the drought the year before had turned the fields to powder. She had not left when Fletcher Yount, the man who owned 3/4 of the buildings in Harlan's Crossing, had come to her with a smile full of ambition and told her the building her post office occupied might be changing hands soon. She had stayed because staying was the thing she knew how to do, and because the people of this town needed their letters and their telegrams and their connection to a world that sometimes felt very far away. She was a tall woman, not slender the way fashion magazines from back east liked to paint women, but strong in the way the territory made people strong. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned at the nape of her neck while she worked, and eyes the color of good river water, somewhere between green and gray depending on the light. She had her father's stubbornness and her mother's precision, and she ran that post office with the kind of careful dedication that made people trust her with things they would not trust to a stranger. The man who walked through the door on that Tuesday morning in April was not a stranger to hardship. That much was plain just looking at him. He was 30 years old, though he looked like a man who had lived those years in full. He stood just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that came from actual labor rather than pretension, and he wore a dark brown trail coat over a plain shirt, with a hat that had seen better seasons but had not yet given up on this one. His boots were good boots, the kind a man invested in when he expected to be on his feet for a long time. He had a few days of dark beard along his jaw, and eyes that were an unusual shade, somewhere between amber and brown, the kind of eyes that caught light the way a creek caught sunlight, unexpectedly and all at once. He was carrying a leather satchel, and he set it on the counter with a particular kind of weight that suggested the contents were important and also something of a burden. "I am looking for the Land Records Office," he said. His voice was even, not unfriendly, but with the directness of a man who did not have time to waste on pleasantries he did not mean. Virginia looked at him steadily. "You are standing in the post office and telegraph station," she said. "The land records are kept by the county, and the county seat is in Colfax, which is 40 miles northeast of here. However, the local claims registry is kept by Sheriff Aldous Pratt, whose office is 2 buildings down on the left, assuming he is awake." Something moved in those amber-brown eyes, something that might have been the beginning of amusement, though it did not quite make it to his mouth. "Much obliged," he said, and he picked up the satchel. He paused at the door, and Virginia did not know why she watched him pause, except that something about the way he stood in a room suggested he was a man full of things that had not yet been said. "Cecil Donnelly," he said, and he said it as though he were placing something on the table, the way you put a card down in a game so the other person understands you are playing. "Virginia Hale," she said, because it seemed only fair. He nodded once, and then he was gone through the door and into the hard April light. Virginia stood at her counter for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the rectangle of light where the door had swung shut behind him, and then she turned back to the stack of mail she had been sorting, and she told herself firmly that whatever Cecil Donnelly had come to Harlan's Crossing to collect, it was none of her business at all. She believed that for approximately 4 hours. At noon, when she closed the post office for the midday hour and walked across to the general store for a tin of tea and a sack of cornmeal, she found half the town buzzing with a particular kind of low, sideways conversation that meant someone had done something, and that everyone knew what it was, and that nobody was going to say it directly. She bought her tea and her cornmeal from old Erasmus Finch, who was 73 and had been in Harlan's Crossing longer than the town itself had a name, and who had an opinion about everything and the patience to deliver it slowly. "You meet the fellow from Santa Fe," Erasmus said, wrapping her cornmeal in paper. "I met a man named Donnelly," Virginia said. "That is the one." Erasmus tied the string around the paper with fingers that moved slowly but surely. "He works for the Territorial Land Administration, came up to look into some debt claims, something to do with the Yount holdings." Virginia kept her expression even. "Fletcher Yount." "The same." Erasmus pushed the package across the counter. "Word is Yount has been filing land claims on properties that were never legally his to claim, using the drought and the hard years to muscle people out, and then filing papers like he owned the thing all along. The territory sent this Donnelly fellow to look into whether the claims hold up." Virginia thought about Fletcher Yount's smile when he had come into her post office 3 months ago and told her the building might be changing hands. She thought about how he had said it with that particular tone that was just short of a threat but wanted you to know it could become one. "Is the post office involved?" she asked. Erasmus gave her a long look. "Your father owned that building outright, Virginia. He bought it fair and clear in '68. You have the deed." "I have the deed," she confirmed. "Then you have nothing to worry about." She picked up her packages and said goodbye, and she walked back to the post office in the bright noon sun, and she thought that the arrival of Cecil Donnelly in Harlan's Crossing was perhaps not the trouble she had initially felt it might be, and perhaps was something more complicated than that. She was right about the complicated part. That afternoon, a woman named Ruth Garza came into the post office to send a telegram to her son in Albuquerque, and while Virginia was writing down the message, Ruth said in a very quiet voice that Fletcher Yount had been to see the Donnelly man that morning and had come back looking the way thunderclouds looked before they actually became a storm. And Virginia wrote down the telegram words and kept her thoughts to herself, because the post office was a place where things passed through, and she had long ago learned that a person who worked in a place like that had to be careful about which of those things they let settle. Cecil Donnelly came back to the post office at 3:30, and this time he did not have the satchel with him. He stood at the counter and looked at her with those uncommon eyes, and he said, "I need to send a telegram to the Territorial Land Administration office in Santa Fe. Is the line clear?" "It is," she said. He produced a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and smoothed it on the counter. It was a formal telegram form, the kind he had clearly written out beforehand. Virginia read it with the professional neutrality of a woman who had read 10,000 telegrams and knew better than to react to any of them, but this one was harder to be neutral about. It outlined, in the compressed language of official correspondence, that he had found what appeared to be 6 fraudulent land claims filed in the past 18 months, all touching properties in or adjacent to Harlan's Crossing, all bearing the name of one Fletcher Yount, and that he was requesting the full authority to conduct a formal review and halt any transfer of said properties pending investigation. Virginia sent the telegram. She sent it clearly and accurately because that was her job and she took it seriously. Cecil Donnelly paid her the sending fee, and then he did not leave immediately. He stood at the counter and looked at the wall behind her where she kept the rows of mailbox slots, small wooden cubbies she had built herself the year after her father died, because the old system of stacking everything in piles had driven her to distraction. "You built those yourself?" he asked. She glanced at the mailboxes. "I did. They are well made." "I had time and a good saw," she said, and she did not know why she said it that way, as though she were dismissing it, because she was actually very proud of those mailboxes. "Sheriff Pratt tells me you have been in this town your whole life," Cecil said. "My father came here in '62, she said. "I was born here in '54, so yes." "Then you know these people." "I know everyone in this town," she said. "It is that kind of town." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him weighing something, some decision about how much to say. "Fletcher Yount," he said. "What kind of man is he?" Virginia set down the pen she had been holding. She looked at Cecil Donnelly with the directness she had inherited from her father, and she said, "He is the kind of man who confuses having money with having the right to take more. He has been in this county for 8 years, and in that time he has acquired things in ways that never quite looked wrong but never quite looked clean either. He is charming when he wants something and cold when he has already gotten it." Cecil listened to this without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "That matches what the paperwork suggests," he said. "The paperwork usually does," Virginia said, "but the paperwork does not know what it feels like to live next door to the thing the paperwork describes." That landed differently than she had intended it to, which was not something that happened to her often. She was precise with words. She had grown up reading everything that came through this post office, the letters people sent and the letters they received, the grief and the joy and the ordinary news of lives being lived, and she had become a person who understood that words had weight and should be placed carefully. Cecil Donnelly looked at her for a moment that stretched a little longer than necessary, and then he said, "No. I suppose it does not." He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the counter edge, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Hale," and he walked back out into the afternoon. Virginia stood at her counter and acknowledged to herself, with the same directness she applied to everything, that she was going to be thinking about Cecil Donnelly for the rest of the day. She was irritated by this in a fond sort of way, the way you are irritated by a song you cannot stop hearing. The next morning brought complications, as mornings in the territory were inclined to do. Virginia arrived at the post office at 7 in the morning, as she always did, to find a note shoved under the door. It was not in an envelope, just a folded piece of brown paper, and when she unfolded it she read, in large unsteady letters that suggested someone who was either frightened or in a hurry or both, "Do not help him or you will regret it." She stood in the early light reading the note twice, then a third time. Then she set it on the counter, put the kettle on the small iron stove she kept in the back room, and went about opening the post office in the ordinary way. When Cecil Donnelly came in at 8 o'clock, she handed him the note across the counter without comment. He read it. Something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite name, and then his jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anger held carefully in check. "When did you find this?" he asked. "This morning under the door." "You are not frightened," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I have been managing this post office alone for 2 years," she said. "I have had drunk cowboys fire guns at the sign outside. I have had men tell me a woman has no business running a telegraph station. I have had a whole drought and a whole year of people's grief come through this building. Fletcher Yount's handwriting is not the most frightening thing I have seen in this room." He looked at her for a long moment. "You recognize the handwriting?" She had not actually looked that closely, but now she did, and yes, she recognized it. Fletcher Yount wrote his capital letters with a distinctive leftward lean that she had seen on the outside of dozens of official-looking envelopes over the years. "I believe I do," she said. Cecil folded the note carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "I will be speaking to Sheriff Pratt today. I would appreciate it if you would be available to make a formal statement about receiving this." "I will be here," she said. "I am always here." There was something in the way she said it, some weight she had not intended, and she saw him notice it. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the morning light came through the dust-smeared window and lay across the counter between them like something neither of them had put there. "Do you have family here?" he asked, and it came out gentler than she thought a man like him probably intended. "I had my father," she said. "He passed 2 years ago. My mother died when I was 11. I have a cousin in Denver, but we have not corresponded in some time." "I am sorry," he said, and she believed him, which was not something she was accustomed to believing when people said that. People said it as a social mechanism. He said it as though he understood the specific texture of being alone in a place and staying anyway. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "St. Joseph. My family had a farm there before the war. After the war, not so much." She understood what that meant, and she did not press it. "You came west," she said. "I came west," he agreed. "Spent some years doing various things. Eventually found that I have a particular ability for reading land documents and finding where the numbers do not line up. That is an unusual talent," she said. "It is not the most glamorous," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly in what she was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile. She liked it. She was aware that she liked it, and she was aware that this was not entirely convenient given the circumstances. Sheriff Aldous Pratt, when presented with the threatening note and Virginia's statement about where she had found it, scratched his chin for a long time and said he would look into the matter. Cecil Donnelly, standing beside Virginia in the sheriff's small office that smelled of old coffee and horse leather, looked at the sheriff with the patient expression of a man who had dealt with slow-moving law enforcement before and had learned that pressing harder did not always help. Virginia had a theory about Sheriff Pratt, which was that he was not a bad man, but he was a man who had gotten comfortable with looking the other way when Fletcher Yount was involved, because Fletcher Yount was the largest single source of income and employment in the county, and because comfort was a difficult thing to voluntarily surrender. After they left the sheriff's office and stood in the bright morning on the main street, Cecil said, "Is the sheriff bought?" "Not in money," Virginia said. "In ease. He likes an easy life. Fletcher makes things easy for people who do not bother him." "Which you do," Cecil observed. "I run the post office," she said. "I sort the mail. I send the telegrams. I keep my nose out of other people's business unless their business comes through my door." "And today it came through your door," he said. "Today it did," she agreed. They stood in the street for a moment, and Virginia squinted at the horizon where the mountains rose blue and distant against a sky so clear it almost hurt. "You should be careful," Cecil said. "Not because I think you cannot handle yourself, because I think Yount is a man who does things before he thinks them through, and that makes him less predictable than a man who plans." Virginia looked at him. "Is that your professional assessment?" "It is my personal one," he said. She nodded. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Donnelly." "Cecil," he said. She paused. "Cecil," she said. He looked at her for just a moment longer than was strictly practical, and then he put his hat back on and turned toward the hotel. The formal investigation that Cecil Donnelly was conducting moved with the measured inevitability of official processes, which meant it moved slowly, but it moved certainly. Over the next several days, he interviewed people throughout the town and the surrounding farms and ranches, gathering testimony, comparing documents, cross-referencing claims against original deed registrations. Virginia saw him every day when he came to send his telegrams to Santa Fe, and sometimes he came in twice, once in the morning and once in the evening, and they had begun the slow, careful negotiation of two people who are aware of each other and are simultaneously trying to be practical about it. He was methodical. She was precise. They shared a quality of attention, a way of listening to people with full focus rather than waiting for their turn to speak, and she noticed that he noticed this about her, the same way she noticed it about him. On the third evening, he came in at the close of day when the light was going gold and red over the mountains, and she was just finishing up a letter she was writing to the territorial postmaster about a supply request. The post office was empty except for the two of them, and he leaned against the counter rather than standing formally in front of it, which was a small shift that meant something, and they both knew it. "I found something interesting today," he said. "Tell me," she said, putting down her pen. "The old Mackler homestead 3 miles east of town. Clara Mackler is a widow, 60 years old, has been on that land since 1865. Yount filed a claim on it in January claiming she had defaulted on a property loan she took from his office in '76. He paused. "I found the original loan document. The interest he is charging her is 3 times what is legal under territorial statute. Which means the loan terms were fraudulent from the beginning, which means the default is invalid, which means the claim on her property is fraudulent." Virginia felt the particular satisfaction of watching something wrong get named. "Clara Mackler is a good woman," she said. "She has been in here twice this year near tears. She thought she was going to lose that land." "She is not going to lose that land," Cecil said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a controlled fire, the kind of thing a man had when he believed in what he was doing. Virginia looked at him in the fading light, and she thought that she had met very few people in her life who did what they said they would do in the way they said they would do it. Her father had been one. And she was beginning to think this amber-eyed man from Missouri might be another. "You genuinely care about this," she said. "It is not just the work." He was quiet for a moment. "I grew up watching my family lose things," he said. "The farm, the house, my father's health. Some of it was the war, and some of it was drought, and some of it was men with papers and better lawyers who knew how to use the legal system like a tool to take what did not belong to them. I became good at reading documents because I wanted to understand exactly how it had been done to us. And then I realized I could use that understanding to stop it from being done to other people." Virginia sat with that for a moment. The lamp on the counter burned steadily between them. "That is a very good reason to be good at something," she said. He looked at her directly, the full weight of those amber eyes settling on her face, and she did not look away because she was not someone who looked away. "You have been managing alone for a long time," he said. "I have," she said. "Does it suit you, or is it just what you do because it is necessary?" She thought about it genuinely, the way the question deserved. "Both," she said. "I am good at managing. I am less fond of the alone part." The lamp flame moved in some draft from the window seam, and the light shifted, and Cecil Donnelly looked at her in that shifted light with an expression she recognized, because she had read enough letters between enough people to know what it looked like when someone was in the early stages of something they had not yet found the words for. "Virginia," he said. "Cecil," she said. He straightened from the counter. "I will be here another week at least while the investigation concludes. I would like to take dinner with you if you are willing, somewhere in town." "Rosario's," she said, because that was the only place in town that was neither a saloon nor someone's private home, a small restaurant run by a woman named Rosario Vega who made the best green chili stew in the territory and would find something to put on a table that was not entirely made of beans. "Tomorrow evening?" he asked. "Tomorrow evening," she confirmed. He put on his hat, picked up the satchel, and moved toward the door, and then he stopped in the doorway the same way he had on that first day, and he said, "Thank you, Virginia." And this time it was not just for the telegram. She did not sleep well that night, which was unusual for her, because she was generally a person who slept soundly on account of being consistently exhausted. She lay in her bed above the post office, in the 2 small rooms she had made into a home with her father's furniture and her own particular additions, the bookshelves she had built along one wall and the good quilt she had made herself in the winter. And she looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about amber eyes and the particular way a person's voice could have a quality of realness to it that made everything else sound like something from a different category. She was sensible enough not to romanticize it. She was also honest enough to admit that she had been lonely for a long time, not the dramatic tearing kind of lonely, but the low and steady kind, the kind that settled into the background of a life lived well but lived alone, and that Cecil Donnelly's presence had disturbed that background in a way she found both alarming and genuinely welcome. The next day passed in its ordinary rhythms, mail to sort and telegrams to send, and people coming in with the small emergencies and ordinary needs that accumulated in the course of a town's daily life. Cecil came in mid-morning with 2 more telegrams for Santa Fe, and they spoke briefly and professionally, and there was something careful and warm in the space between the professional words, the kind of thing that existed in the negative space of a conversation rather than in the conversation itself. At 5:30, she locked the post office and went upstairs to change her dress. She had 3 dresses, a working dress, a second working dress, and the dress she wore to church, which was navy blue with white buttons down the front and had been her mother's originally, altered to fit Virginia's taller frame. She put on the navy dress and did her hair more carefully than usual, and she told herself this was simply what one did when going to dinner with a person, and that it did not require any more interpretation than that. Cecil was waiting outside Rosario's at 6 o'clock, having exchanged his trail coat for a dark jacket that fit him better than she had expected, and when he looked up and saw her coming down the street his expression did a thing she was glad she did not miss, a quick honest pleasure that was there and then composed itself, but not quickly enough. Rosario Vega's restaurant was warm and smelled of chilies and wood smoke, and Rosario herself, a stout woman in her 50s with a magnificent braid down her back and the unflappable manner of someone who had cooked through everything the territory had to offer, brought them a corner table and a pot of coffee and the stew that Virginia had promised, thick and fragrant with roasted chilies and tender pork. They ate and they talked, and the talking was the kind that builds a thing between 2 people who are paying genuine attention to each other. She told him about her childhood in the territory, about her father teaching her to read land claims and telegraph code before she had fully learned her multiplication tables, about her mother's death from fever when Virginia was 11, about the strange, quiet persistence that had become her primary mode of being in the world. He told her about Missouri and the farm before the war, about 2 brothers he had lost, one to combat and one to a fever in '63, about learning to read and calculate in a 1-room school, and finding that numbers were the thing that made the most sense to him in a world that did not always make sense. He was 30 years old and she was 24, and they were both people who had been formed by loss and had chosen, separately, to build something from the material loss left behind. "You could have left," he said at some point, and she knew he meant the town, the territory, the small life she had built here. "I could have," she agreed. "My cousin in Denver offered after my father died. Good position," she said. A friend of hers needed a clerk. "But you stayed." "This is mine," she said simply. "The post office is mine. These people are mine, in the way that a town belongs to the people who choose it. I did not want to go be a clerk somewhere." He looked at her over his coffee cup with an expression that was open and direct and honest in a way that made her chest feel like something warm had been put inside it. "I have been in 15 towns in the past 4 years," he said. "I go where the work is, find what is wrong, fix it if I can, move on. It is a good life. It is an efficient life." He paused. "It is a somewhat empty life." Virginia set down her coffee cup carefully. "What would make it less empty?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in the warm light of Rosario's restaurant with the smell of chilies in the air and the low murmur of other diners around them, he said, "I am beginning to have a particular answer to that question." She did not look away from him. She had good steady nerves, Virginia Hale, and she used them. "We have known each other 5 days, she said. "I know," he said. "I am not suggesting anything reckless. I am suggesting that I would like to know you better, and that I am aware that knowing you better requires being here, and that being here is not what my work usually allows for." "Your work brought you here," she said. "It did," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I am not anxious to finish and leave." Rosario brought them a plate of fried bread with honey and said nothing, But Virginia caught the small, satisfied expression on her face as she moved away, which told her that Rosario had been listening, which was not surprising, because Rosario listened to everything, and Virginia appreciated that about her. They walked back toward the post office in the cool April evening, the sky above them enormous and full of stars in the way that the territory sky could be, vast and crowded and humbling, and Cecil walked beside her with an inch between their arms that felt charged. At the door of the post office he stopped, and she stopped, and they stood for a moment in the dark street with the yellow light of the window above casting a small glow down. "Good night, Virginia," he said. "Good night, Cecil," she said. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face with a gesture so simple and careful that it left her standing in the dark for a good 30 seconds after he had walked away, looking at the empty street. The next morning she found Fletcher Yount waiting at the post office door when she arrived to open up, and the pleasant feeling of the previous evening did not exactly disappear, but it stepped back and made room for something cooler and more watchful. Fletcher Yount was 42 years old, and had the look of a man who had once been attractive, and had converted that attractiveness into a currency. He still spent freely even though the original capital was dwindling. He was well dressed for the territory with a vest and a good hat, and he had the particular kind of smile that showed all his teeth. "Miss Hale," he said, "lovely morning." "Mr. Yount," she said, taking out her keys. "The post office opens at 7. "I know," he said pleasantly. "I was hoping for a word before you open." She unlocked the door and went in and lit the lamp on the counter and turned to face him across it. She did not invite him around to her side of it. "I understand you have been helping the gentleman from Santa Fe," Yount said. His voice was still pleasant, which was the part that required the most wariness. "I have been doing my job," Virginia said. "Which includes processing telegrams from all paying customers." "Of course." He rested his hands on the counter. "I just wanted to make sure we understood each other. This building, for example. Now, your father bought it in '68, I know that. But the land it sits on, the lot itself, was recorded through my office back in '74 as part of a street improvement arrangement with the county. So the question of who exactly owns what here is a little more complicated than people might think." Virginia had heard this before in a vaguer form, but now it was sharper and she recognized it for what it was. "I have my deed," she said. "And if there is a competing claim on the lot, I look forward to examining the paperwork with the full attention of the Territorial Land Administration." Something moved behind Yount's pleasant expression. "I would hate for this to become complicated for you," he said. "You are alone here. You have worked hard to keep this place running. It would be a shame to have that work undermined by an unnecessary conflict." "Mr. Yount," Virginia said, and her voice was entirely level, "I have been handling mail and telegrams for this territory for 2 years, and before that with my father for 15 years. In that time, I have held confidence on military dispatches, private banking communications, and personal correspondence of every imaginable variety. I have never violated a confidence, never allowed a document to be tampered with, and never let a threat stop me from doing my job. You have had a note delivered to my door, and now you have come here personally. I suggest that you let the legal process that Mr. Donnelly is conducting proceed, and that you address your concerns to the appropriate authorities rather than to me, because threatening me will not accomplish what you hope it will accomplish." Fletcher Yount stared at her. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this directly by anyone, and certainly not by a woman alone behind a post office counter. He put his hat back on and his smile did not entirely come back. "Think carefully, Miss Hale," he said, and then he left. Virginia stood behind her counter for a moment, and then she picked up the pen she used for ledger entries and wrote down, with date and time, exactly what Fletcher Yount had said, word for word, in the order he had said it. She folded the paper and put it in the drawer with the threatening note she had kept, and she decided she would tell Cecil about this when he came in. He came in at 8:30 and she told him, and she watched his face do a thing she found interesting, which was that the careful professional composure he carried did not disappear exactly, but it went very thin, like a layer of ice over something much warmer and more forceful. "He threatened you," Cecil said. "He implied a threat," she said, carefully worded so it could be interpreted otherwise. "He implied a threat," Cecil repeated. "Because of me. Because of the investigation," she said. "Do not make the error of thinking this is personal." He looked at her steadily. "Is that not what you told me when you gave me the threatening note?" "That one was also about the investigation," she said. "And yet you are the one being threatened." "I am the one who is accessible and visible," she said. "The post office is the communication hub of this town. If he can make me stop helping you send telegrams, he slows the investigation. It is a logical, tactical decision." "It is also harassment of a woman on her own," Cecil said, and his voice had an edge she had not quite heard in it before. She softened just slightly. "Cecil," she said, "I can handle Fletcher Yount." "I know you can," he said. "That does not mean you should have to." They looked at each other across the counter, and Virginia thought that she had been right about him back in those first days when she had thought he was a man full of things that had not yet been said. Some of those things were beginning to make themselves known, and they were the kinds of things she found entirely worth knowing. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to finish this investigation quickly," he said, "and I am going to make sure the fraudulent claim on this lot, if there is one, is addressed in the official report, and I am going to speak to Sheriff Pratt about Yount's behavior this morning." "Pratt will not do much," she said. "No," Cecil agreed, "but a formal complaint is on the record, and the record matters." He went to the sheriff's office and filed the complaint, and then he came back and spent an hour at the counter going through documents he had laid out, cross-referencing the claim on the post office lot with the original county street improvement arrangement from '74. Virginia brought him coffee and watched him work, and there was something both domestic and wholly unusual about having a man at her counter bent over documents with that kind of focus, and she found she did not mind it at all. By noon he had found the problem. The street improvement arrangement Yount had referenced was real, but it pertained to the roadway itself, not to the privately owned lots adjacent to it. The county's interest in the road did not extend to the buildings on either side. It was a deliberate misrepresentation, and Cecil wrote it up in his notes with the precise language that would carry weight in a territorial court. "The post office is yours," he said, looking up at her. Virginia felt something unclench in her chest that she had not even realized was tight. "I knew it was," she said. "But now it is in writing," he said. "Now it is in writing," she agreed, and she felt the difference between knowing something and having it confirmed, which was the difference between faith and evidence, and she appreciated evidence. That evening they walked along the creek at the edge of town, the Rio Puico running low but still moving, the cottonwoods young-leafed and pale green in the late light, and they walked the way people walk when they are not going anywhere particular, but are glad to be going there together. Cecil talked about the cases he had worked, towns he had passed through, the particular loneliness of being always in transit, always the official presence rather than the neighbor or the friend. He had been engaged once, he said, to a woman in Albuquerque 2 years ago, but she had found the life of a traveling investigator unsuitable for building a home on, and he had not blamed her, and had blamed himself only for not knowing sooner what kind of life he actually wanted. "What kind of life do you actually want?" Virginia asked, and the creek moved beside them quietly. He walked a few paces in silence. "Something that stays in place," he said. "I have spent a long time moving and I am good at it, but I do not think it is what I want permanently. I want the kind of life where I know where the coffee is in the morning and where I sleep at night." "That is a modest wish," she said. "It is one I have found surprisingly difficult to fulfill," he said. She thought about what it must be like to be him, moving from town to town with the satchel and the documents and the talent for finding things that did not line up, staying just long enough to fix what was broken, and then leaving before anything else could settle. "Have you thought about what you would do if you stopped traveling?" she asked. Occasionally, he said. Land office work, perhaps. Survey work. There is always a need for someone who can read boundaries and titles. He paused. The territory is opening up. There will be homesteads and new towns and all of the paperwork that goes with them. A man with my particular skills and a settled address could build a decent practice. He said this in a measured way, but the way he said it carried something else underneath, the quality of a man thinking aloud about something he had been thinking privately for some time. Harlan's Crossing has no one like that, Virginia said, equally measured. I had noticed, he said. They had reached the bend in the creek where an old cottonwood had fallen years ago and made a kind of natural bench, its bark silver and worn smooth by seasons, and they sat on it without discussion, the way people sit when they have arrived somewhere neither of them had consciously decided to go to, but both of them had been heading toward. The sun was low and the light was the particular golden color of late afternoon in the territory, and Virginia looked out over the water and felt the closeness of him beside her, the warmth and the solid realness of it. I find you very difficult to be practical about, he said quietly. She looked at him. Is that meant to be a complaint? No, he said. It is meant to be an admission. She turned toward him on the log and he turned toward her, and they were very close, close enough that she could see the specific texture of the few days' beard along his jaw and the exact shade of his eyes in the fading light, amber and dark and entirely focused on her. Cecil, she said. Virginia, he said, the same way, her name in his voice like something he had been learning the weight of. He kissed her or she kissed him, and it was probably both, a gentle and certain thing, neither tentative nor reckless, and it tasted like coffee and the particular sweetness of a thing that had been building toward itself and finally arrived where it was meant to arrive. When they separated, she was looking at the creek and so was he, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because some things do not need to be immediately narrated. Then he said, I am going to finish this investigation. I know, she said, and then I am going to go to Santa Fe and file the complete report. I know, she said, and then I am coming back, he said. She looked at him, this man she had known 9 days, this man who had come to collect a debt and had found something he had not expected. How certain are you of that? She asked, because she was a person who needed to know the actual answer to questions rather than the comfortable one. Entirely, he said, and there was not a trace of equivocation in his face. Then I will be here, she said. I am always here. The next 4 days were the most complicated and the most clarifying 4 days Harlan's Crossing had seen in some time. Cecil worked through the complete collection of fraudulent claims with the systematic intensity of a man who has a clear purpose and a limited number of hours to fulfill it. By the time he was done, he had documented 9 separate instances of fraudulent property claims filed by or on behalf of Fletcher Yount, affecting 8 different parcels of land and 7 different families or individuals. Among those were Clara Mackler's homestead, the lot under Virginia's post office, 2 small cattle operations east of town, a parcel of farmland belonging to a family named Esperanza who had farmed it since before the territory was a territory, and several others. He sent his final compiled report via telegram from Virginia's station, a lengthy and meticulous document that went to the Territorial Land Administration in Santa Fe and to the Territorial Governor's office. Virginia sent it and sent it accurately, and felt the weight of each word going down the wire like something long overdue. On the day Cecil sent the final report, Fletcher Yount's reaction was loud and brief and ultimately self-defeating. He appeared at the sheriff's office with 2 men Virginia did not know, both of them large and professionally unfriendly looking, and he made a scene about obstruction and interference and outside interests meddling in local affairs. Sheriff Pratt, to his partial credit, told Yount that a formal territorial investigation was not something the sheriff could intercede in, and that his best course was to obtain legal representation, which was good advice, and which Yount did not take well. Nothing violent happened, which Virginia was grateful for, though for one afternoon there was a tension in the town of the kind that sits in the back of your teeth. By evening things had quieted. Virginia stood at the door of the post office and watched the main street settle into its ordinary evening rhythm, the horses at the rail in front of the saloon, the light in Rosario's window, a couple of children running in the dust before their mothers called them in. Cecil came to find her there. "It is done," he said. "Everything is filed and on its way to Santa Fe. They will send an official order within the week halting all transfers pending review. The fraudulent claims will be invalidated in due course." Virginia let out a breath she had been holding for 9 days or possibly 2 years. "Clara Mackler can keep her homestead," she said. "Clara Mackler can keep her homestead," he confirmed, "as can everyone else." She looked at him in the evening light. He was tired, she could see it, the good kind of tired that came from work finished properly rather than the bad kind that came from going around in circles. His trail coat was dusty and his jaw was more bearded than it had been when he arrived, and he looked entirely right standing on the main street of Harlan's Crossing in a way that should not have made as much sense as it did after 10 days. "When do you leave for Santa Fe?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "I need to present the report in person. There will be meetings. It may take 2 weeks. 2 weeks." She could manage 2 weeks. "And then," she said. He crossed the distance between them in a step and a half, and he kissed her in the middle of the main street of Harlan's Crossing in the evening with several people watching, which would be talked about for the better part of a month. She kissed him back thoroughly because she was not someone who did things halfway. "And then I come back," he said, "and I have a conversation with you about permanence." "That sounds like a reasonable plan," she said, and she was smiling, the full wide smile she did not give away often, and she watched his face when he saw it and she felt entirely sure about him in that moment, clear and certain as a line on a survey map. He left on a Friday morning early, before the post office opened, and Virginia stood in the street and watched him ride out on the bay horse he had hired from the livery, the satchel secured behind the saddle, and he turned in the saddle at the edge of town and touched the brim of his hat to her, and she raised her hand. She went back inside and made coffee and sorted the mail, and she told herself 2 weeks was a short amount of time. The 2 weeks were long, as weeks in the territory tended to be when you were waiting for something. But they were not empty. There was a letter from Cecil on the 10th day, a real letter, handwritten on good paper in the careful, precise hand she had not seen before but recognized instantly as him. He told her about Santa Fe, about the meetings with the land administration, and the preliminary confirmation that the fraudulent claims were being invalidated, about a particularly dull dinner with a territorial official that had made him think of her cooking abilities, which he had not yet experienced but hoped to, and about a bookshop on Burrow Alley where he had found a volume he thought she would like, which he was bringing with him. She read the letter 3 times and then put it in the drawer where she kept her important papers, the deed to the post office and her father's will, and the letters her mother had written from the years before Virginia was old enough to read them, and she thought about what it meant that this letter belonged in that drawer, and she found she was entirely comfortable with what it meant. She wrote back. She wrote about the town, about Clara Mackler coming into the post office with a pie, which she had not expected, and about the fact that Sheriff Pratt had found a slightly more upright posture since Yount's men had left town, and about the cottonwood along the creek that was now fully leafed and beautiful in the spring. She wrote, toward the end, that she had been thinking about his question regarding permanence, and that she had views on the subject that she looked forward to sharing when he returned. She sent the letter to the Santa Fe address he had provided and felt the small, quiet joy of having something specific and real to send. Fletcher Yount, stripped of his leverage and facing the consequences of the investigation, became a quieter and smaller presence in Harlan's Crossing. He did not leave, but he became markedly less expansive, which the town adjusted to with the ease of people who had been waiting for the adjustment for some time. His claims were officially invalidated by the Territorial Land Administration, 6 weeks after the investigation concluded, and the properties were restored to their rightful holders. The Esperanza family, who had been particularly at risk, celebrated with a dinner to which they invited what seemed like half the county, and Virginia went and ate tamales and danced to fiddle music with Clara Mackler, and felt the particular happiness of a wrong thing being made right. Cecil came back on a Wednesday, which was a better day than Tuesday, and he arrived in the early afternoon on a new horse, a good sturdy roan, with the satchel and with saddlebags that had clearly been added to since he left. Virginia was at the post office counter when she heard the horse outside, and she told herself not to look out the window immediately, and she lasted approximately 3 seconds before she looked out the window. He came through the door and set the satchel on the counter, and he looked at her and said, "Virginia." "Cecil," she said. He reached into the saddlebag he had carried in, and he produced the book from the Borough Alley bookshop, a collection of essays on the natural history of the Southwest, and he set it on the counter, and she looked at it and then at him, and she thought that a man who paid attention to what a person might want to read was a man who paid attention in the ways that mattered. "Welcome back," she said. "It is good to be back," he said, and there was something in the way he said back, as though the word had a specific address, and she understood that address was this building, this counter, her. They had dinner at Rosario's again, and Rosario brought them the same corner table and made an expression that said she had never had any doubt about this particular development. They talked for 2 hours about the investigation, about Santa Fe, about the letter she had sent, and the parts of it he had liked best, and then they talked about other things, slower and more careful things, the kind of conversation that is really a negotiation and both parties know it and are glad of it. "I have been in contact with the county assessor's office," Cecil said. "There is a need for a certified land surveyor and titles examiner in this county. It is not a grand position, but it pays reliably, and it is based here." Virginia kept her expression even with considerable effort. "That is interesting," she said. "I thought you might think so," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that was his smile. "Where would you live?" she asked. "The hotel is not particularly suited to permanence." "There is a house on Linden Street," he said, 2 rooms and a good kitchen. The owner wants to sell rather than rent." He paused. "Though I had been wondering whether a house on Linden Street would be better suited to more than one person." Virginia put down her coffee cup. "Cecil Donnelly," she said. "Are you telling me you have been back in this town for 4 hours, and you are already discussing real estate in a way that has an unmistakable implication?" "I am," he said, entirely composedly. "I have been thinking about this for 2 weeks. I have been thinking about it with full seriousness, and I would like to have the conversation directly." She looked at him across the table in Rosario's restaurant in the Territory Spring. This man she had known 17 days total if you counted the 2 weeks apart, which she was not sure you could count, and she thought about everything she knew about him, which was quite a lot for 17 days, and also felt like not enough, and also felt like exactly the right amount. "Ask me the question properly," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was the first time he had taken her hand, and his hand was large and warm, and she could feel the roughness of work in the skin of his palm. "I did not come to Harlan's Crossing expecting anything beyond a case to resolve," he said. "I came to collect what the territory owed the people who were being cheated of it, and instead I found the only thing that has made me want to stop moving. I found you. I found your name on the first day, and I have been finding out more about what it means ever since." He paused. "Virginia, I am asking you to let me court you properly, with the full and honest intention of asking you to marry me when the time is right, which I hope will not be too very long from now." Virginia looked at him for a long moment, this man with the amber-brown eyes and the honest voice and the talent for finding what did not line up and making it right. "Yes," she said. "Yes to the courtship. And I am fairly certain about the other part already." He smiled then, the full version, and she saw it for the first time entirely, unguarded and real and warm, and she thought it was the best thing she had seen in a long time. "Good," he said, and he held her hand on the table, and they sat in Rosario's with the night outside and the lamp burning warm between them. The spring moved into summer with the slow, golden progression of the territory seasons, and Cecil began his work with the county assessor's office, while Virginia ran the post office. And they were in each other's company, with an increasing frequency, an ease that the town accepted and observed with the particular satisfied attention of people watching something good happen to people they liked. They walked in the evenings along the creek, and they had dinner at Rosario's twice a week, and on Sunday afternoons Cecil came to the post office and they sat together reading, him with his survey documents and her with one book or another, and it was the kind of comfortable shared silence that is more intimate than most conversation. He asked her on the 22nd of June, which was a Sunday evening, standing on the small porch of the house on Linden Street that he had bought, the house with 2 rooms and a good kitchen, and a view of the mountains from the back window. They had been there that afternoon helping his neighbor, an elderly man named Horace Birch, carry in a piece of furniture that was too heavy for one person, and then they had sat on the porch afterward in the long summer evening, and the mountains had been blue and clear in the light. He had been carrying the ring for 2 weeks, he told her later. He had ordered it from a jeweler in Santa Fe during his visit, a simple band with a small turquoise stone that was the color of the territory sky, because he had thought about what suited her, and what suited her was not elaborate, was beautiful and true and simple and enduring. He asked her plainly, and she said yes plainly, and then they held each other on that porch in the summer evening, with the mountains watching and the cottonwoods moving in the dry, warm wind. And Virginia thought that she had never in her life felt so entirely and securely placed in her own life, as though she had always been standing on the right ground and had simply not known it until now. They were married in September of 1878, in the church that leaned slightly east, which the town of Harlan's Crossing understood to be leaning that way out of approval, and the wedding was attended by what was genuinely most of the town, including Clara Mackler in her best dress and Rosario Vega, who cried freely and without apology, and the Esperanza family, who brought enough food to feed everyone twice over, and Erasmus Finch, who gave a toast that was long and wandering and deeply heartfelt. Virginia wore her mother's navy dress, which she had altered one more time to add a collar of white lace she had ordered from a shop in Albuquerque, and she carried a bunch of late summer wildflowers that she had picked herself from the creek bank that morning. Cecil wore his good jacket and a new shirt, and had shaved with the particular care of a man who wanted to be his best version on a significant occasion. Sheriff Pratt, who had been quietly improving himself for the past several months, and had recently made 2 actual arrests of some significance, attended with his wife and looked genuinely moved, which surprised everyone including himself. The Reverend, a young man named Tobias Moore who had come to Harlan's Crossing that summer from Ohio and had not quite gotten used to the altitude yet, read the ceremony in a voice that occasionally went thin but kept its conviction, and when he got to the part where Cecil and Virginia exchanged their vows, the church was so quiet you could hear the September wind outside moving through the eaves. Cecil looked at Virginia with everything open in his face, all the things that had not been said on that first day, and all the things that had been said since, and he said his vows with the same directness and precision he brought to everything. And Virginia understood that, for him, those words were not ceremonial but actual, each one placed with full intention. Virginia said her vows back and meant every syllable of them, and when the ring was on her finger and the Reverend said the words that closed the ceremony, Cecil kissed her, and the church made a noise that was half applause and half tears, and entirely the sound of a community genuinely happy for 2 of its own. They moved into the house on Linden Street together, the house with the good kitchen and the view of the mountains. Virginia kept the post office, of course, because it was hers, and because the town needed it, and because she was good at it. Cecil kept his work with the county assessor's office, and he was very good at it, and within a year he had cleaned up the remaining confusion in the county's land records with the same systematic care he had brought to the Yount investigation. Fletcher Yount, some months after the wedding, sold his remaining legitimate holdings and left Harlan's Crossing for somewhere farther west, and the town did not miss him in the way it might not miss a persistent headache. The buildings he had owned were bought by their occupants or by new people who came to a town that was, under the influence of things being done properly, beginning to grow in the measured, hopeful way that towns grew when the ground under them was solid. The house on Linden Street gained a bookshelf in the fall, which Cecil built from good pine planks on a Sunday, and which Virginia filled with the books she had accumulated over the years above the post office, and the new ones they bought together in a shared library that did not try to separate his interests from hers, because their interests turned out to overlap considerably. In the winter, they sat by the iron stove in the evenings, Virginia writing her correspondence and Cecil working through survey documents, and they talked and read and were quiet together with the perfect ease of two people who had found in each other not an excitement that burned out but a warmth that stayed steady. In the spring of 1879, Virginia told Cecil that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a morning in March when the mountains were still snow-capped and the light was cold and clear, and she told him directly as she told him everything, and she watched his face change in a way she had not seen before, something vast and grateful and a little undone at the edges. He crossed the kitchen and held her for a long time, and she let him, which was unusual for her. She was not generally someone who needed extended holding, but she found on this occasion she did not mind it at all. Their son was born in October of 1879, in the house on Linden Street, delivered by the town's doctor, a careful man named Paul Hensley, who had come down from Colorado the previous year, and who said afterward that he had rarely attended a birth where the father remained so calmly and attentively present throughout. Cecil had held Virginia's hand for 8 hours without being asked, and without complaint, which Virginia noted and appreciated. They named the boy Thomas, after Cecil's brother who had died in the war, and Thomas Donnelly came into the world with a considerable amount of dark hair and his father's unusual eyes, amber brown and attentive from the first days, regarding everything around him with the expression of a person who intends to understand how it all works. Clara Mackler came to see the baby and brought a quilt she had made, blue and white and very carefully stitched, and she held Thomas with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised children of her own, and said that he had a fine look about him, which Virginia took as the high compliment it was intended to be. Erasmus Finch came to the general store to announce the birth with the enthusiasm of a man who had something new to have an opinion about, and the town celebrated in the distributed, quiet way that towns celebrated personal milestones, with small kindnesses and dropped-off food, and the warm attention of people who were glad for their neighbors. Cecil held his son in the evenings, and Virginia watched him become something she had not known he could become, and then recognized immediately as something she had suspected all along was there, a quality of tenderness that his efficient professional self had kept carefully stored, and that Thomas had immediately and entirely uncovered. The years moved with the good, steady rhythm of a life being built by people who knew what they wanted and were willing to do the work of it. Virginia ran the post office and watched Harlan's Crossing grow, new families coming in, new buildings going up on streets that had been empty lots, the railroad extending its reach toward the territory and bringing with it a particular kind of transformation that was both promising and required watchfulness. She expanded the post office operation in 1881, adding 2 more telegraph lines to meet the increased demand, and she hired a young woman named Petra Sandoval to help her, a sharp-minded girl of 19 who had grown up in the territory, and who took to the telegraph work with a quick intelligence that Virginia found very satisfying to watch. Cecil's county work grew as the county grew. He was appointed to a formal position as County Land Registrar in 1880, which was a title that made Harlan's crossing sound important and also genuinely formalized work he had been doing informally for 2 years. He was fair and thorough, and had a reputation that extended beyond the county for the simple reason that he could not be bought and would not be pressured, which in a territory still sorting itself out was worth considerably more than most other qualities. He remained, in his private self, the man who had come to this town with a satchel and found something he had not come looking for. He was still the man who kissed Virginia in the mornings when she left for the post office, who read beside her in the evenings, who walked the creek with her on summer evenings while Thomas grew from infant to toddler to small determined boy who understood horses with an instinctive ease and had very firm opinions about everything. In the fall of 1882, Virginia told Cecil she was expecting again, and this time he was more collected about it, which she found mildly amusing. "You are less surprised this time," she observed. "I am equally glad," he said. "I have simply learned to express it differently." Their daughter was born in April of 1883, and they named her Eleanor, after Virginia's mother. Eleanor was smaller than Thomas had been and louder in opinion from practically the first hour, and she had Virginia's green-gray eyes and the particular determination that ran through both her parents in slightly different forms. Thomas, who was 3½ regarded his sister with the cautious evaluation of someone presented with something he had not ordered but was willing to consider, and within 2 weeks he had appointed himself her primary guardian and supervisor, a role he took seriously, and which Eleanor would spend her childhood alternately appreciating and resisting. The house on Linden Street was full and warm. Virginia's bookshelf had expanded to 2 shelves and showed no sign of stopping. Cecil's survey maps were framed along the hallway, a history of the county's legal clarification made visual. The kitchen was the center of the house in the evenings, where Virginia cooked and Cecil helped, and the children were underfoot, and the mountains were visible through the back window in the fading light. Some evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in the good chairs Cecil had built in the second year, and they watched the stars come out over the territory sky, that enormous sky that had been above them all their separate lives before they had found each other under it. "Do you remember the first day you came in?" Virginia asked him once, in the summer of 1883, the evening light going long and gold. "I remember everything about that day," he said. "You set the satchel on my counter like it was a fact you wanted acknowledged," she said. "I was trying to be efficient," he said. "I was not planning on anything beyond the case." "You stood in the door on the way out," she said, "and you told me your name." "I do not know why I did that," he said. "I did not usually tell people my name in that particular way." "What particular way?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains going dark against the last light. "Like it was something I wanted you to know," he said. Virginia looked at him, this man who had come to collect what was owed and had found instead the thing that could not be collected but only given, a name, a life, a particular and irreplaceable person in a small post office in the territory. "I am glad you told me," she said. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the chair, the same way he had taken it across the table at Rosario's on the evening he had asked to court her, the same hand, warm and real and steady. "So am I," he said. Inside the house, Thomas made a sound that suggested he had not gone to sleep as told, and Eleanor responded to this with the particular decisive noise that meant she had formed an opinion about it, and they both had to try very hard not to laugh. "I should go in," Virginia said. "A moment more," Cecil said. She stayed a moment more, and the stars continued their appearance above the territory, and the mountains stood in the dark where they had always stood, and the cottonwoods along the creek moved in the warm night air, and the town of Harlan's Crossing went about its ordinary evening in the way towns did when the ground under them was solid, and the records were in order, and the people who lived there were, on the whole, being treated fairly. Virginia Donnelly, who had been Virginia Hale since she was born and would always be Virginia Hale in the way that mattered, which was in the bones, sat on the porch of the house on Linden Street in the good chair her husband had built and held his hand in the dark. And she thought about everything the territory had cost her and everything it had given her, and she found the accounting came out well. Inside, the children settled, and the house breathed the quiet breath of a house full of people who belonged in it. Cecil squeezed her hand once. The specific pressure that meant a particular thing between them meant something like, "I am here, and I know you are here, and this is exactly where I meant to be." She squeezed back, the same message in her specific pressure. They sat in the territory dark for a little while longer before they went inside to their life. And it was the kind of life that did not require explanation or embellishment, only the daily choosing of it, which they had both decided on and continued to decide on, deliberately and gladly, in the good ongoing way of people who know precisely what they have and are not in any danger of taking it for granted. The moon came up over the mountains, large and yellow-white, and the territory stretched out around Harlan's crossing in every direction, vast and unapologetic, and full of the remains of every story that had ever happened in it. This was one of the good ones.